We now start the beginning of the end for ethics, looking at part 4, the rights and basis of liberty. We'll begin by looking at rights. There are many questions that arise in the context of rights. Some of these are, do people have natural rights? If people do have natural rights, what is the basis for those rights? What artificial rights should people have? What rights should people have against the state? Now, to answer these sorts of questions, we of course have to look at what are we talking about when we talk about rights. Now, thinkers tend to divide rights into, much like polarities, into positive and negative. A positive right is an entitlement. So it's not merely that one has the right, sort of the opportunity, one also is provided with the means. As an example, currently in the United States, a K through 12 education is a positive right. Not only do people have access to it, they're also provided without receiving like a bill in the case of public education to that education. Obviously, of course, someone has to pay for it, taxes, etc. But the idea is that the public education is a positive right. A negative right is a right that is supposed to forbid others in certain, restricted areas, depending on the nature of the right, from taking action against a person. It gives them, a freedom, essentially. So, for example, a right to free speech does not provide one with the means of free speech, but is supposed to provide protection from the interference of others. So, in the case if I have a moral right to free expression, that on most accounts does not entitle me to say, a free computer in which to write, or free access to the internet in which to present it, or airtime on TV, or even, access to say whatever I want on social media or YouTube. A negative right simply forbids other people from interfering with me. And there are, of course, all kinds of limits and restrictions. Like in the case of free speech, people always like to say, well, that does not give you the right to yell fire in a crowded theater and do other things. And whether a right is positive or negative can sometimes be seen as a matter of perspective. So if we have the right to life, that can be seen as a positive thing. People are entitled to life, or it can be looked at as people are forbidden from killing others. So positive right, entitlement; negative right, kind of a forbiddenness usually on others, or essentially allowing one to do things. So why do we have rights? Laying aside all the metaphysical debates about their foundations, etc., their main function is to define limits. What is it that we are allowed to, morally allowed to do to other people or restrict them? And also in terms of our, our rights, what we might define in terms of liberties, to do things without impedance. And this, of course, leads to, in terms of positive rights, questions about defining entitlements. Morally, what do we have the right to in terms of, say, getting, stuff? Looking more into rights, I mentioned before natural rights. They're a popular concept in political philosophy, especially, philosophy arriving from or developed in the United Kingdom, English philosophers, Scottish philosophers, etc. We have people like John Locke famously, and also, of course, Thomas Hobbes. So natural rights work like this. You get natural rights just because you exist. They don't depend on society. They don't, come from people deciding whether you have these rights or not. So they're natural. And this is the sort of thing that was very popular, again, with thinkers like our good dead friend John Locke, and also our good dead friend Thomas Hobbes. As one would suspect, there is considerable dispute about whether there are such natural rights, and they typically involve some sort of metaphysical assumptions, which is why they're often, controversial. And even people who believe in and accept natural rights, there's a great deal of dispute among them in terms of what is their basis and what is their content. What rights do we have? In the case of Locke, as we'll see, he bases his natural rights on God. That's where they come from. We see this also in the United States, where people talk about being endowed by our Creator with these natural rights. In the case of Thomas Hobbes, since he maybe believed in God, but definitely a strange kind of God, as we'll see for him, God either maybe doesn't exist, or if he does exist, he's a material being. But God bases his natural rights on nature, broadly construed, pretty vague, and reason. So it doesn't explicitly appeal to God. And it's interesting to see the difference between Locke and Hobbes based on their metaphysical differences. And this is a case where metaphysics really connects into ethics. Artificial rights are less controversial than natural rights in that you don't need any like special, metaphysics behind them. Artificial rights are, exactly what it sounds like. Like natural flavors are ones you find, in nature, like the flavor of a lemon, for example, or the flavor of honey. And artificial flavors are one that we create, which may replicate, natural flavors like lemon or honey, etc. So the artificial rights are ones we just make up. They're granted by the rules, the laws, the traditions, the informal rules of society or other organizations or groups. So the legal rights we get, on the face of it, the ones that are created by laws that people pass, those would be all artificial rights. Ones you get for belonging to particular groups, such as being a student at a university, those would be artificial rights as well. So these rights are created by people and enforced or not by people. These would include, such things as legal rights, which are just, if they're just, purely legal, laying aside like concerns about the foundations of laws, if you're bringing in metaphysics, etc. But law, for the most part, people just make that stuff up. So they're artificial. Civil rights are usually variants of legal rights, also typically artificial, although there are people that argue that we should have natural rights that are civil rights. Employee rights within, contracts and law, also, of course, not surprisingly, artificial. Now, artificial rights might or might not also be taken to be grounded in or based on something other than just we make stuff up. You could bring in, artificial rights that people create that may have a stronger foundation than we just make them up. But that is also a matter of dispute. Now, people do often come to regard artificial rights as being natural rights. It becomes such a, people get kind of, might say maybe they get confused or something, and they think that, say legal things laid out in law are natural rights or moral rights. A good example of this is that people often think that the right in the Bill of Rights in the United States, the First Amendment, is a natural right that is, say, a moral right. And people also think that it extends beyond what it does. So people often complain about how Facebook, blocking them or deleting their content, or YouTube taking their content down, is violating their First Amendment rights. But of course, they're wrong about that, because the First Amendment just applies to, to the government and not to private companies. People might also come to regard artificial rights as guaranteed entitlements, etc. Other mistakes people make, as I noted, is thinking that a right in one area gives you a right in another area. Again, the example being the First Amendment. People often take that to be granting, say, a moral right to censorship, or against censorship to people who want to post on social media, etc. But of course, that doesn't, the legal rights don't extend to moral rights necessarily. So the natural rights are ones you just get. They come from nature, whatever that might be. Could be God, could be nature, could be whatever. Artificial rights, primarily the ones we just kind of make up. They're ones we get from society. And people can, of course, make the case that artificial rights could be based on something else. We might say we make them up, but we create them on the basis of, say, ethics or something, or religion. Now, we also need to look at the notion of rights in society. Most natural right theorists take the view that even if you have natural rights, you give up some of those when you enter into society, enter into civilization. Now, he doesn't mean like they're not talking about how, people live outside and, in the wild and then agree to come into society. They're talking about this thing called the state of nature, which we'll talk about in a bit. For example, Hobbes claims initially, pre-society, at least theoretically, people have a right to like everything. More on this later. And when we form civilization, we give up some of these rights. There are also, of course, rights, according to natural, rights theorists, that we retain some of those when entering society. We don't give them up. For example, Locke takes the view that even without artificial laws, without society, without laws passed by people, we have a God-given right to life, one to liberty, and one to property. So even if one believes in natural rights, there's still the question of when humans are in society, which ones do we keep all of our natural rights? Do we keep some of them? How do they work in the natural rights work in society? And different philosophers, shockingly enough, have different views. There's also a concern about what rights we might have against our own governments. These, at least in theory, practice may vary, of course, limit the power of government over the people. There can be, of course, artificial rights that put these limits on the government. Essentially, the people making the laws put restrictions on themselves, put restrictions on the government. For example, the US Constitution, legal document, lays out many rights that the citizens have in the Bill of Rights that limit the government. And these, as laws created by people, they're artificial rights that people just, make up. But these do, in theory at least, provide limits, legal limits on the government. Natural rights, of course, are also taken often to limit the government. For example, Locke claims that the rights to life, liberty, and property put limits on what the government can morally or justly do. Hobbes also claims that people have a right to self-preservation against the rulers. Roughly put, if the government tries to kill you, according to Hobbes, you have the right to try to kill them right back. So, of great concern are, what are natural rights? Do we have any? What are they? Artificial rights? What are those? Which ones should we have? Should we have rights against the government? If so, which ones? And now we turn to what I mentioned when I talked about the state of nature. So, good question is, what is the state of nature? This was something that was quite popular during the time, this notion, this idea, popular during the time of like Locke and Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And this was something typically regarded as theoretical as opposed to historical. Most of the thinkers, like Hobbes and Locke, didn't say they discovered, a historical truth, an anthropological truth about how things actually took place. It's a thought experiment. We're asked to imagine a situation in which there's a complete absence of political and legal authority. There's no state, there's no government, there's no artificial laws, there's no other societal limits on behavior. Basically no government. And in terms of, again, Locke and Hobbes don't say like, okay, they know historically this was the way how things went. They're doing it as a theoretical thought experiment to see, well, what are they trying to see? Well, the question they're trying to address here is, if you had no government, no authority, no police, no laws, what would justify governmental authority? What would justify going, at least theoretically, from a state of no government to government? What would justify this political authority? And so the thinkers consider what's involved in making the transition from their state of nature to a state of society, a civil state. And this is also used to examine natural and artificial rights. So they would raise questions such as, when you do not have, hypothetically, this thought experiment, if we had no, no politics, no government, no laws, etc., nothing artificially created like that, would we still possess rights? And once we get into society, what rights would we have, or should we have, once we have society? As I noted, there's some dispute about whether there ever was such a state in the past. Most thinkers present it, a purely theoretical device saying, okay, doesn't matter if it's real or not. Let's just imagine if there was no government, what would justify having one? And this can be done if you want to do like a sci-fi type of scenario. You can imagine like pick your favorite apocalypse or least favorite apocalypse, zombie apocalypse, fungus apocalypse, squirrel apocalypse, zombie squirrel fungus apocalypse, where everything collapses and people are trying to like rebuild, civilization. How would that be justified, to form government? What would justify people, being in power? Locke does actually think that perhaps maybe there was such a state, considers the possibility. He does draw some examples during the time Locke was locking. Europeans were heading to what we now call the United States, North America. And Locke believed, that the wilds, what he saw as the wilds of North America, might have been a state of nature scenario. Clearly he was wrong about this. There were people there who already had functional governments, etc. But you could clearly imagine, for example, if people just met in the wild, out in the wild with no governments around, say like if you had, trappers from England and French trappers, and they run out into the woods where they meet up in the woods where there's no government, they would be in a state of nature because there would be no like authority over them there. But in general, it doesn't really matter whether it existed or not historically, because their argument is not aimed at saying, hey, this is a matter of historical fact. Their question is theoretical. If we hypothetically had no government, what would justify having a government? Now, in terms of real state of nature stuff, there are some that do clearly exist. For example, although nations, we have agreements and treaties, we pretty much exist in a state of nature. There is no, there's a UN, but there's no, world police that, a power that holds over all of us. Again, we do have some, we're not like in total chaos and anarchy because we do have, we have the UN, we have treaties and agreements. But of course, no nation recognizes an authority or power, that has sovereignty over it. Also, when you have cases where a civil authority completely fails, it could be localized, like in a disaster when the government is just, effectively wiped out by a natural disaster, or when people are refusing to accept the authority of the state and government has failed. And so those would be cases where you would have like a kind of a state of nature scenario because there'd be no effective authority. Now, in any case, fortunately, whether the state of nature existed or not is not critical to the purpose for which it's used. Again, so philosophers who do this, their concern is not with saying this is what historically happened, here's a story that's historically accurate. The question again is, if you have no political authority, what would justify having it? And this, of course, it applies even when a political authority exists, because you can still raise the question, okay, this political authority is here, but what justifies it? You can ask the question, why should I listen to those people? So what is the basis then of political authority? So authority is often defined as the capacity to be obeyed without the need to expend power and resources. People just do it just because you say so, because of your position. So you don't have to use force against them. You don't have to pay them. You don't have to burn, like, as they say, political capital. People just do what you say. So generally it's like a good thing to have for yourself because you don't have to expend resources to get people to do stuff. Now, it's generally accepted, but of course not by everybody, that states, nations, etc., have authority over their citizens, and hence the citizens have an obligation to obey. There are, of course, those who reject this. Anarchists, for example, totally reject that. It's also broadly accepted that there are at least some limits on the authority of the state. Like, there's some things they don't have the moral authority or right to do. And this is a matter, as you might imagine, of great debate. And depending on when and where you are in the world, it can vary quite a bit. So a key question here is, what is the basis of authority? One answer is there is none. Anarchists might say there is no basis. It's just made up. People just make this up to get you to do stuff, usually because they want to do bad things. Usually like oppression, exploitation, etc. Now, if it's not nothing, then a very practical answer is basically it begins with power. If you can initially force people to obey, then eventually it's kind of a habituation thing. Like at first, you might have to expend, some violence, etc., to scare people, and then eventually it becomes habitual, and people obey, and one does not have to hit them or harm them to get them to go along. But this may be just seen as just a form of threat, a threat of violence or harm, which may not seem as really authority, more just a threat that is not always acted upon, or is acted upon, but doesn't have to be acted upon to scare people. Now, moving beyond just zero, there is nothing, it's all made up, to essentially it's based on, power, force, violence, etc., and people eventually go along out of habit or ingrained fear. One popular view was, back in the day, was that the rulers would gain their authority from a divine source. Way, way back in the ancient days, it was apparently not uncommon for rulers to claim divine origin. They might claim themselves to be a god, or they might claim to be the children of gods, or some sort of descendant, trace their ancestry back to Zeus or something. Now, when Christianity and Islam and Judaism arise, and you lose that, or people who profess to believe in Christianity and Islam and Judaism, they can't claim anymore to be gods or the children of gods because for obvious reasons. So, what do they turn to? Well, kind of the next best thing, if you can't be like God, or you can't be like God's kid, then the claim is that God has chosen you to rule. It's called the divine right of kings, at least in Europe. The idea being that one has kind of a mandate from heaven to rule. No, not surprisingly, if you look at the actual history, as far as one can tell, it doesn't seem to have been the case that, God showed up and said, hey, you're now king, and there was this big miraculous glowing, and everyone, realized this. What it typically seems to have been historically is somebody is really good at, getting people to to follow them, to kill other people, and then they eventually become the king, and then their family just keeps passing it down, over, throughout history until someone else comes along and, beheads them or something. But anyway, so there is kind of that divine or supernatural justification for authority. More recently, although this does go back to, ancient conceptions of democracy, that the foundation of the authority of the state is based on the consent of the people. That the reason why the ruler has authority is because people agree to give them authority. Yeah, that's democracy, etc. Now, there's also, in some cases, still monarchies around today. Some countries like Saudi Arabia, etc., have powerful monarchies. Others, like the United Kingdom, have monarchies that really don't have a lot of actual power. They get tons of money, but not really a lot of power. And these are hereditary. Why is Charles king? Yeah, because his mom was. Why was his mom queen? Well, because because she inherited. And then the question that arises, what's the original basis of the authority? And again, typically looking back in the past, you have someone who is probably pretty good at killing other people or getting other people to kill people for them, and they secured the throne and just passed it down, and people just, for whatever reason, went along with it. Although occasionally, again, sometimes people decide they like to be king, and they go and kill whoever's on the throne, and they start up their own hereditary. But the hereditary monarchies don't really explain where the authority comes from, because you still have to trace it back to where it originally came from. Otherwise, you're off on a regress. Now, if we do accept authority, then there are questions about the legitimate uses of authority and its legitimate limits. So the question here is, what are the legitimate limits of authority? And of course, the answer will vary greatly. Some thinkers place very strict moral limits on authority, often based on rights. John Locke, for example, he presents the state as existing to serve the good of the people, and believes that there are very strong and strict limitations on what it can do. It could, it's not allowed to interfere with the right to life, liberty, and property without adequate justification. Other thinkers place few or no moral limits on what the state can do. Thomas Hobbes, for example, effectively says the state, the sovereign, can do anything as long as the sovereign is able to maintain order and stay in power. If the sovereign does decide to place some limits on its authority and what it does, that would be allowed. But for Hobbes, the only real requirement is staying in power and maintaining order. Now, authority, of course, requires obedience, because if people didn't listen to the king or the president, etc., I mean, sure, they could, like the king could take out a sword and start stabbing people, or a president could grab a gun and start blazing away at people. But of course, that's not really authority. That's just that's something any of us could do. Any of us could pick up a weapon and hurt someone else and yell at them to do things. And so a good question is, why, when somebody claims to be a king or a president and they start yelling at us, telling us to do things, why should we go along with them? And laying aside the threats of violence and death and stuff. Is there a moral obligation on our part to obey the state? Now, most thinkers, political science thinkers, except for obviously for the anarchists, argue that there's at least some obligation. But of course, they vary in terms of what they think this should be. John Locke believes that we have an obligation to go along with the majority, but there are grounds for resisting the state and resisting authority. Hobbes' view is, well, we're supposed to obey the sovereign as long as the sovereign is able to enforce obedience, essentially. So it's for Hobbes, it's that we're supposed to keep our agreements, but it's more, as we'll see, it seems to be more of a purely kind of practical thing, that I should stick to my agreements when I expect other people to do so. But it really gives a person, no moral obligation to obey the state in a deeper sense. Socrates lays out a pretty extensive case in the Crito about why people should remain obedient to the state. And there, of course, there are those who do argue for disobedience in varying degrees. Locke allows for that. Henry David Thoreau, in his essay on civil disobedience, he argues, for exactly that. We have, of course, Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King arguing for civil disobedience. Now, there's also, of course, the question of, why do we even have states? Why do they exist? What is their purpose? Now, those who might be a bit cynical, people typically on the far left, philosophically, politically, etc., often see the state as especially the anarchists, see the state as existing as a tool of repression, that it serves those who hold political and economic power, and it's simply a method to oppress people and exploit them. Now, other thinkers who aren't like anarchists, they tend to take the main function of the state at a minimum to be protection of the citizens from enemies, foreign and domestic, and the enforcement of laws. That these are kind of the minimum. You gotta basically have military functions and just basic police functions. And of course, other thinkers add in, more stuff beyond the bare minimum. Locke, for example, argues that the state is obligated to serve the good of the people. That's, for him, its entire function, protect their right and to protect their life, liberty, and property. Aristotle, as we saw when we looked at moral education, he goes to pretty, not like the extremist view, but he goes pretty far, and he takes the view that the state should be actively compelling people to make them good. In terms of like other answers, well, there's one could spend an entire academic career talking about the various views of the purpose of the state. But again, there's kind of like the minimal function that it's got to at least protect citizens from enemies, foreign and domestic. And then there's all kinds of questions beyond that. We get into very, very practical political debates about things like healthcare. Should that be provided by the state? Retirement should be provided by the state. Should the universal basic income? And so all of that stuff is part of the debate about what is a state supposed to do. So that takes us to the end of the introduction. In our next adventure, we'll take a look at our good dead friend Thomas Hobbes and his view of the state of nature and his solution to the state of nature. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.